Thanks for coming, everyone. We're here to listen to and appreciate Alan Cowell on the paperback publication of his excellent and very funny novel, The Paris Correspondent. It is not, despite the cover blurb, a very gripping novel, which Simon Sebag, for some reason, Simon Sebag Montefiore thinks that this book is a thriller, which it isn't. It's about as gripping as Scoop, which is the book. I think this is a modern Scoop. It's just as funny and just as good and just as legitimate a take on contemporary journalism as Scoop was on the journalism of its time. Alan is, as most of you probably know already, a very distinguished and honored foreign correspondent with the New York Times. He's been with the New York Times for 31 years. After he finished at Oxford in French and German, he went to work in local newspapers, the Lancashire Evening Post, Cambridge News, and then went to Reuters. Right? That's when I first met him in Southern Africa in the late 1970s, when he was doing excellent work covering the Ian Smith regime's war against ZANU and ZAPU, and developments in the unwinding of apartheid in South Africa. 31 years ago, he left Reuters to go to the New York Times, where he's been ever since, where he received a nomination for a Pulitzer Prize, where he received the George Polk Award for distinguished reporting. And if you ever read his copy in the International Herald Tribune, you'll know that he is a very straightforward, solid reporter whose reporting you can rely on to tell you exactly the facts you need to know. It's very dry. It's sometimes, when he does his column, very acerbic, very straightforward. But what you don't know if you read him just in the New York Times is that he's actually a very beautiful writer. And this isn't his first book. This is his third book. He's published another novel, and a very probably the definitive take on the assassination of Lukashenko in London. This book is so well written and so funny that if you don't read it, you're really missing a bet. I want to talk a little bit about the book. It tells the story of a newsroom in Paris, of an American newspaper in Paris, probably loosely modeled on the International Herald Tribune, with which the New York Times shares space and which the New York Times owns, and where Alan spends many hours of every day. And for those of us who remember how journalism was when we started, it's a very different world now, because newspapers are no longer put to bed at night. They go for 24 hours, just like radio and television, and they have their internet sites that need constant feeding and updating, and this has created a rather humorous dynamic with the old hacks who aren't quite used to that pace and that style, and that very mean style of reporting, with the publishers not paying for anything, trying to get you to work for as little as possible, not covering all of your expenses and making you thrive. And this is hard on us old-timers who were used to staying at the George Sank and flying first class and having a rather good life, suddenly finding ourselves sleeping at the YMCA and taking the bus. I just want to give you a little bit. I would like to read it, but I think it's better if Alan reads it. I just wonder if he would read a short passage describing what an old-time newsroom was like. And on pages 17 and 18, he does describe it. And if he could read it, then I want to ask him a couple of questions about that.
Can I just break in and could I ask if I could read from the inspiration of this book? It's a book written many years ago by Reynolds Packard, called The Kansas City Milkman, which was then republished as Dateline Paris. This is probably before the collective memory of everyone in this room, but it was just after the Second World War. And so what I was trying to make the contrast with was something that was in this book, which is the beginning of Dateline Paris. So I'll read a bit of the master here and then my own reference to that. And this is the beginning. Don Shelby slipped inobtrusively through the door. He seemed confused by the cacophony of the teletypes, the tickers and typewriters. They're all probably technologies that I'd have to explain to the younger people here tonight. And the inattention that he received from everybody, but that's familiar to all of us. There must have been 8 or 9 people there, but they were all working like mad. There were 2 women typing like mad, several men typing like mad, 2 office boys shoving paper about like mad, and an operator sending off copy like mad. Myself, I was trying like mad to bat out urgents on an American plane crash from the flowers and music that I was getting from our Le Bourget stringer in lieu of facts. Never mind how tenderly the French gendarmes removed the bodies, I growled into the phone. Let's have the number of dead and injured first. So that's his newsroom, and now with the modern one. In newsrooms of yore, and still on period movie sets, there'd been the rattle of typewriter keys and the ring of a bell as the carriage reached the end of its travel and was slammed back to start a new line with the abrupt ferocity of a train wreck. There had been muttered curses and vicious metal spikes skewering palimpsests of discarded copy paper and service messages. There'd been ashtrays and clerks scurrying hither and thither, pneumatic tubes whizzing metal containers stuffed with folded pieces of paper from copy editors to typesetters in the linotype room. There'd been the loud chorus of news arriving on long-forgotten machines as the world trembled on the brink of history. Snap, coup in Nigeria, bulletin, Saigon falls. Modern newsrooms were quiet as the grave, a particularly apt simile for our industry. We communed in the dark interstices of cyberspace. We could announce World War III in a whisper, and in a way, as it turned out, we did. So that's the new newsroom.
And now, speaking of Reynolds Packard, who you introduced me to a couple of years ago, and I read the Kansas City Milkman. I don't know why they changed the name. I like the Kansas City Milkman, but I came across Packard in his Rome days, in his memoirs about. He was an American United Press correspondent in Rome before and during and after the Second World War, and when he landed with the Allies, he came across a deserter. He was driving out in his Jeep near Salerno. He came across an American deserter who had thrown his weapon away and said, "I'm not going to fight anymore. I can't stand this anymore." And Packard said, "Get in the Jeep. I'll take you back." He said, "I'm not going to get in the Jeep." He says, "Shut up." And he cold-cocked him, knocked him out cold, grabbed his rifle, took him back to base. And his driver said, "Why did you do that?" He says, "Well, if I don't give him back his rifle, take him back, he's going to be shot as a deserter. So I'm taking him back." And he had and we have a mutual friend in Paris, John Randall, who is an old Washington Post correspondent, who knew Reynolds Packard, and he said Packard used to hold court at Harry's Bar in Paris, and actually whenever he did lose his temper, he would punch somebody. He was and he's a big fat man, or short big fat man, who just loved punching people. And he had possibly the best dedication, which you have in your book.
Well, yeah, he dedicated his Rome book. I think it was dedicated to, this book is dedicated to my wife's lovers in friendship and admiration. So
you can see it was a very good source of inspiration for your book.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Mine is dedicated to a French poet, so it's much tamer in that regard. So, yeah.
But the characters are, one of your characters is very much in that mold, isn't he? The philandering, swashbuckling, romantic.
I think the main lead male character in this book is a guy called Joe Shelby, who'd been in an earlier novel I wrote called A Walking Guide. So many people thought it was a walking guide that it didn't even walk off the shelves. But when I got to Paris in 2008, which I'd never lived in Paris. I'd visited many times, so I found that this was kind of a new city to me. It was, if you work in a place, it's much harder to come to grips with it. And if you just visit, you pass through, you just skirt over the top. But I particularly remembered this book, Dateline Paris, which had been published as Kansas City Milkman. And I was quite surprised to find out that it stars a man called Don Shelby, who clearly, this was an omen that I had to write the new lead as an old wire service reporter. I had to put the new top on it and a coat of varnish and get it ready for a newer cycle, a newer news cycle, which I guess we did. But Joe, in this book, Joe Shelby is someone who's not only has a reputation that he does his best to keep alive as a swashbuckling, two-fisted war correspondent. He's also a person, it's all catching up with him, not only the history of how we process the news and send it out to the world, but also in his personal life. So there are several tracks to the book, which mean that while he might begin the book in one way, he ends it in a different space altogether, which I think it says in the manuals is how you're supposed to do these things. Yeah.
And he has two great loves of his life, two French women photographers.
Yeah, one of whom he's treated badly, and the other of whom he's treated badly.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
and as a result, they both adored him. And they, but are these characters based on people we know?
Well, a lot of people say to me, "Are you Joe Shelby?" And I say, "Look, I'll read to you from the very first line of the book, beyond the prologue, to prove, textually, as a former Oxford man, that it can't possibly be true." This is how the book starts. Warily, watchfully, point on patrol in hostile terrain, Joe Shelby surveyed the newsroom of the Paris Star, the stained carpeting and exposed air conditioner ducts, the battered battleship grey paintwork of his new professional home, his Valhalla. He walked with a cane made of ebony, its handle fashioned of yellowing ivory from some distant age when laws did nothing to protect the elephant. This cane has no ebony or ivory. So you can see that it's, but I mean, clearly, if you're writing a book, you tend to take the furniture, what I call the furniture of a book, so the job descriptions, the physical appearances, the whole city of Paris is like a huge canvas to paint against. But what happens once you establish that basic furniture, that dynamic, can go off in any number of directions. So I think if there are any similarities to people I've known at the beginning, they're certainly not autobiographical, and it certainly moves on into a different area as the book progresses, I think.
But the photographers, the two women, reminded me of Françoise de Mulder and Catherine Leroy, because they both were in both the Vietnam and the Middle East, as you
Indeed.
And they sounded rather like them.
Well, there was one moment, I do remember, I was privileged to be covering a story with Catherine Leroy in Beirut years ago, and there is a quote from her I borrowed in the book where we were walking back from what was then the front line, and we came under fire, which I'm sure is familiar to many people in this room, and I ran, being with a very familiar instinct called cowardice, and she didn't, and she just said, "I will not run for these bastards." So I thought, well, good for you, but I will. And there is a scene in this book which, again, it would be familiar. Anybody who went to Françoise de Mulder's funeral in Normandy a few years ago might recognize the scenery there. The character herself, I think, is Faria Duclos in the book is a different person who goes back again to a walking guide, the earlier book, and then carried on and into a very sadder and unfortunate kind of environment in this book.
Do you, either in the book or in your own view of the news business, see advantages and disadvantages to doing it the old way as opposed to the new way?
I think there are, first of all, we can't not do it the new way. It's not an option to say, I'd like to go back to how it was. I mean, maybe if maybe you can spend a lot of time on a story, you'll never ever be free of the BlackBerry or the sat phone. I mean, I can remember once in N'Djamena, I was doing an interview with the then president, Gokuni Wede, and I don't interview many presidents, but he was fairly amenable. There weren't many other people he could talk to at that stage. But there was no telex, no phone, nothing, and you had to go across the river to Cameroon to be able to find a phone in a Cameroonian place called Maroua, where there was a French place called Le Relais de Maroua. And on the bar there was a direct dial telephone, and it was always located next to an ice bucket with a fresh bottle of champagne in. So it had a double attraction, to get there. And there was also a curfew, and you had to get across the Shaori River to get a taxi to Maroua. and you had to be poled across the Shari River in a dugout canoe. And I remember saying to Mr. Wede, President Wede, I said, look, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut this short because I have to catch the last pirogue before curfew, Mr. President. And he said, well, I quite understand. So if you say, is that a more pleasant way of earning a living than slaving over a computer screen all day and trying to bat off tweets like mosquitoes, then yes, it is, for sure. But you can't turn the clock back. And what we have to do now, what we're wrestling with, is bringing the standards and the values that have always made good newspapers sell into this new era. That's my 6 pence on that.
And is it possible to do that, given the way they won't spend money to send people places and to get to know places? Your paper still does, but most papers don't.
To some extent, I think that's one of the things that I think where we all, I mean, everybody really made a mistake in allowing the notion to take root that news is somehow free. And I think anyone in this room who's ever filled out an expense account knows it damn well isn't. And so, we try to soldier on, but I think it's possible. I think people have stepped up to the plate. I think people make huge efforts. They work very hard. They work harder, and they achieve their goals in many respects. I think what I don't sympathise with is aggregators who don't make that basic investment. I mean, I think we can all criticise our accounting departments, as indeed people in the book do, but the reality is that they've got no choice but to try and make this work, and we have to try and work within the constraints that there are.
In the book, you do complain about management quite a bit, which you can read one of those passages, one on page 232, or you can also talk about, if you want, you can read about print, that great, gorgeous, messy alchemy on page 39.
Okay.
Both of which will give everyone here a bit of a feel for your view of these things.
Okay. The divine beast of print, to which we had bowed throughout our professional lives, to which we had made our offerings of articles and news and all too transient prose, was expiring. If we'd imagined that our words alone could sustain it, we were wrong. Deprived of the advertising lifeblood they craved, newspapers were foundering like misguided skippers on the bridges of so many stricken vessels. Newsmen and newswomen were going down with the ships on which they had once sailed the kindly oceans of expense account lunches, five-star hotels, and mortal peril. Print, that great, gorgeous, messy alchemy of ink and hot type and whirring reels of paper and working stiffs in stained coveralls, was expiring, but not quite finished. Its digital heir, the internet, with its rapid-fire news and needle-sharp technology, was already muscling in, even though, like some itinerant prodigal, some down-at-heel pretender, it could not pay its way. But the days were long gone when those huge newspaper ads from Bloomingdale's and Saks Fifth Avenue financed all our free lunches. So, anyway.
Those days are not coming back.
No, they're not coming back, no. Except for bankers. No, go ahead, that's a different day.
And tell me about the love story, this Joe Shelby's love story with Faria Duclos, because that is the heart of the book. The mystery behind it, and it may well also represent a lot of lost loves that all of these transients in this profession have had.
Well, I think that this is a relationship that it's struck under fire in a war zone. I think that provides a kind of intensity to people. I think I don't cover so many wars these days, but I always used to think that it was covering a war made you very aware of yourself and of your possibilities and of the limits of the people around you and of what humans were really capable of. So it puts you under a huge amount of stress. And I think if you've been out in the field and you've survived, then the celebration of that survival makes for a very passionate relationship, as there is in this book. I think that over time, though, the strains on people, the stresses, the way their lives develop, pushes them apart. And in the end, they reach a stage in their lives when they get to that, well, what if, or phase, and they look back and realize that what it has gone, what has been destroyed by time and the jobs they do, is not also rather like the business. Is you can't turn the clock back to it, and that's the stage. I think that's what people get to in this book, and without even realizing that there is almost a Darby and Joan successor to that they aspire to but can't quite find.
They can't really live a normal life. What come back to London, have a mortgage, and commute to the office. It doesn't really work.
Well,
for them. Well, maybe. But that, in that regard, your two male protagonists, Clancy and Shelby. One is the desk man.
Exactly.
Who survived by not going anywhere, by being present in the office, by doing a good job editing, keeping his foreign correspondents on the straight and narrow, making sure that they're cared for, making sure that management is getting what it wants from them, and so forth. And then Shelby, who's the adventurer, having the great time and taking the risks. And there are two different types, but it seems that also that they're both you in that now you're not a fireman anymore. You've done all that, and you've now taken on this new role of the desk man, you're still reporting, but you're also keeping an eye on copy coming in. And you write on Clancy's behalf in a kind of envious way about the other one, and it made me think that perhaps you're still lamenting the giving up of that old life.
Well, as I said, it's not an autobiographical book, so that's my easy out from that particular question. But I think that on balance, the relationship between people on the desk and people out in the field has always been a fraught one. And with these two characters in this book, it's been fraught. I think if I can find it at the beginning where Clancy is talking about himself, and he says, in the old print days I'd edited his telex dispatches as they winged in from N'Djamena and Kinshasa, Beirut and Grozny. There'd been times when I took dictation from him over the phone from Gaza or Soweto or Saigon to the background drumbeat of gunfire. As he declaimed his story using his particular phonetic orthography, you could almost smell the cordite and hear the boom boom. No, you dummy, P for Peter, H for Harry, U for Uncle, the girl's name was Pook. And so, so I think there is a sense of envy to some extent with the desk person, and but the challenge I think for people out in the field is to realize the immense service that's done by being fielded and looked after and nurtured into publication. The new job, the new way of doing things is completely different, because what you're doing is in real time. So instead of waiting for that moment in the day when the telex chatters and the bells ring, you're actually on the phone to people and you're saying, what can you give me now? What can I make a story of, between us? And that's a very, very nerve-wracking thing to do, because sometimes you're calling people in very, very dangerous places, and the last thing you want to do is draw attention to them, but you need what they can give you. So they have to strike that balance. I mean, the late Anthony Shadid, who died on his way out of Syria, would never, ever stay on a satellite phone for more than a few minutes for fear that would pinpoint his location. But we had conversations in Libya, in Tahrir Square, in many places, and between us, we were able to keep the New York Times website updated in a way that I think provided very, very vivid and up-to-date reporting for the readers.
He was a fine reporter.
Absolutely fine.
One of the best.
One of the best, indeed, absolutely.
One question that probably all of us who've read your publisher's promotion for the book that we would all have is explain how this came about, that you were the last correspondent to file by carrier pigeon.
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, Tony. And I think if there's anyone from Reuters in the house who can dispute that, has anyone filed by carrier pigeon since my adventures in Matabele land?
Absolutely not.
Thank you very much, David. That was my brother, but it's not a biased conversation. We didn't prearrange this conversation. I'm very happy to recount how to file by carrier pigeon if anybody wants to hear it. Otherwise, if anyone really wants to hear it and the others don't, they can buy me a drink later. But I'll be guided by you. So
no, I want to hear it.
You want to hear the Oh my God, I'm so lucky. I've never told this story before. I might stumble over some of the details. Many, many years ago, when Zimbabwe was about to be born, there was a British plan to gather the nationalist guerrilla forces into assembly points out in the bush, and they would then be integrated into the new Zimbabwean national army with their former enemies. So the point was to go to these places and report on what was happening. The problem with the one I was sent to was that there were no communications. There were New Zealand troops there who wouldn't let you use their radio to file, and we had no way of sending a story until on the way there we dropped in to see Sandy Robertson. And I checked these details today in a book I wrote at the time. And he was the last white editor of the Bulawayo Chronicle, that august journal. And he had a friend called Sid Miller, Alderman Sid Miller, who was the last white mayor of Bulawayo. So between them, they enabled us to have access to a huge wicker basket full of cooing carrier pigeons. And we didn't know exactly how we were supposed to cope with them. And he said, look, Sid said, you hold the bird's legs between those fingers, you put your thumb over the neck, you give it a little kiss and whisper something nice to it, and then you loft it up to the air. Nothing could be easier. And you write the story on a 30-pack of Madison cigarettes. There was a little bit of tissue paper inside. You could write 400 words of spidery script on. So of course we get there. We're driving in an armor-plated Land Rover. We pitch camp outside the New Zealand encampment, and nothing happens. So we're feeding our pigeons, and then something small happens. I think some minor development. So we tried it out, and we wrote our 400 words, and we put it in a little plastic capsule, and we taped it to the bird's leg, and we held it like that, and gave it a little kiss, and threw it up in the air, and it spiraled up and went and sat in a tree. So we thought, well, you can imagine what we thought, because we couldn't smoke that many Madison cigarettes to keep up with this. And so we did it again. 400 words, nothing much happening here today, as they wrote in Scoop, except blah, blah. And we did it, and there we are. Up it went, and that one spiraled up, and the one came out of the tree, and they shot off together towards Bulawayo. So we thought, this is wonderful. So finally, things started picking up. A young guerrilla commander in very freshly new fatigues wandered into the camp with a very bright new AK-47 and came and sat with us. And I said, we interviewed him, and then he said, and how are you feeling? He said, I said, I'm very, very hungry. I haven't eaten for days. And at that point, the pigeons started. So, comrade, please don't eat the communications. So finally, in the end, what happened was that he went away again, and he told his comrades it was safe, and this great column came in from the bush. So we finally got a story worthy of our carrier pigeons, and 400 words, smoking the Madisons, and taped it on. Boom, up it went in and sat in a tree. So I thought, bugger, we can't really write these 400 words again. So I got a piece of paper and I wrote, this bird is accompanying the bird that's got the story. And it's a bit like that Hoffnung story. The barrel was now heavier than I was. Anyway, so I did the usual routine. We were getting low on pigeons, so and I gave it a little kiss, and I threw it up in the air, and it circled and shot off to Bulawayo. And the other one in the tree looked at it and shot off in the opposite direction to Botswana. And there was a lot of mystification at Sid Miller's loft that night, because they got this pigeon that arrived and said, this bird is accompanying the bird that's got the story. But scanning the skies, there was no sign. 12 hours later, they said, I'm here, I've got the story, chaps. But of course, they'd missed the deadline by then. So, which never happens, I guess, with satellite phones these days.
Or cleft sticks.
Or cleft sticks, even, yeah. So
Now, if anyone has questions, particularly those of you who've read the book, but those of you who haven't as well, please put your hand up and we'll give you a microphone and you can ask Alan a question. There's always a lot of hesitation to be first, but then it takes off. We should have a ring. Oh, there's one. There's one. Right there. Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying you wanted to ask a question.
No, I was just saying.
Oh. Oh, okay.
Your fellow Pigeon fancier down there. Yeah.
Well, let's see. Perhaps Ray, you might have a question just to get things started. Some. No. Well, David, you might.
No, she said, why don't you ask a question? And I thought that's very rude.
Asking a question.
Because I haven't got a pigeon with me.
Well, this is going to be tough. You know, half the evening is meant to be
Well,
you were asking questions.
Just one thing. How long can you go on doing what you now do in this new age of ours?
Well, I'm just looking at my watch. You're absolutely right. I do think, but I think that it's a very interesting point, and it really is. And I've got yet another textual reference. Won't be worth buying the damn thing if I read it all out, will it? This is seen as a young person's game, and the web producers I work with in New York are predominantly of an earlier generation, the kind of people who say, telex, what the hell's that, Alan? and I say, well, it's a kind of very special machine that you stood in front of and paid people bribes so that you could use in places all around the world. But I think that what we can't at the same time rely on their sources of news. I mean, they are constantly getting in touch with me. We use a thing called AIM. I don't know if you use it. It's a system where you can send instant messages called pings. I mean, in the beginning of the book, Joe Shelby says to Ed Clancy, "So how's this going to work? I ping you. You ping me? You ping me?" He repeated the word slowly and with puzzlement, as if trying to decipher an obscure and difficult text. Ping, instant messages. I write a message over there. I gestured to my desk across the early morning newsroom, becalmed before the deadline panic that would overtake it later. And I press a button and it pops up here. Well, couldn't you just call or walk over? No, these days we ping. Ping. It's the sound it makes when it lands. Ping. Oh, and I pong, I guess. Okay, ha ha, so I ping you, and anyway, so that's how it goes on. But I think this reliance on instant news, on tweets, we still need, you can't rely on it. I don't think that citizen journalism and tweets as a bedrock for news can substitute for the older ways of doing things, and not that because they're older, but simply because they are tested, and because you have to verify things. So what Ed Clancy says in the book is, if you want an objective take on what happens in Afghanistan or Gaza or Cairo or Moscow or Paris, you can't rely on governments and their flaks and spin doctors to tell you. Tweets can be pretty useful, like signposts on a faint trail pointing to the right direction, marking the way through the jungles of official obfuscation and the competing lies of war. But in 140 characters, they can't cover the whole story or explain who's telling it. Anonymous blogs don't share their sources, their biases. They might be for real, they might be rants. Unpalatable though it might seem, you are stuck with the Shelbys and the Clancys to filter it all out. So I think that's true. I think you have to do that, and I think that by and large that does actually provide a role for people who been to some of the places that people are reporting from, have some direct experiences of those areas, and can indeed say, well, this looks like a ringer to me, and this doesn't. So as to the direct question, how long can you keep on doing it? I think if you ask my bank manager, the answer would be, Alan, as long as you can, until you fall off the perch. That would be the answer.
Patrick Coburn.
You referred, briefly to the moment when newspapers and magazines decided to give away their product free. What sort of happened? I mean, even retrospectively, I can't conceive of quite the conversations that took place when people who'd been selling a certain product for a certain amount of money thought it'd be a really good idea to give it away free without affecting their ability to sell the rest of their product for a certain amount of money. Could you sort of talk about that a little? Do you have any understanding of what went through their minds?
It's a question I've often asked, and I think that the only thing I can conclude is that people didn't really, I mean, we're talking what, maybe, when did people start having websites? 15 years ago? And they were seen as adjuncts to the newspapers. They weren't, and what they were rather like the old billboards, you know, Nazi golfer in cat gem heist, you know, Evening Standard, read all about it, and that kind of, and I think that's how the websites were seen, and they were seen as an easy way of replicating that day's paper later, after the paper came out. It was on the web, and the web would be a way of luring people to the newspaper, and it was only when the readers began deserting the newspapers for the websites and the advertisers followed them, that they began to realize that a huge mistake had been made. And recovering from that is exceedingly difficult. I think at the Leveson inquiry the other day, Rupert Murdoch, who'd also dismissed the internet earlier on, had said 5, 10 or 20 years, and we won't be able to afford the trucks or the paper or the ink or the paper or indeed the journalists. So I think it was a big mistake, and that's the only way to explain it, that people did not realize. And I think that's true in a lot of other parts of our lives. No one realized how much the internet was going to take over our lives. No one realized that there'd be tablets that you could have, you know, while whatever else you were doing, and I hope no one's doing this in here, you could be online and checking things out and playing games, and your whole life was going to change. So it was built around Facebook or Twitter or any of the other social media. So no one, it was a lack of vision, and it's a very difficult call to go back now to make people pay for it. And the challenge is to persuade people and to evangelize and to say, you can't do this. You can't send people around the world. You can't get accurate news unless people go to where it's happening, and that costs money, and it has to be paid for. But that's a challenge for on the business side. I think people have to grapple with. I think in a lot of ways, journalists have come to terms with the new reality. Many of them by losing their jobs, but. There is a little bit of one of my pet hates in this is in fact management speak on this issue when they're laying off reporters, and this is from the book where a manager at the Paris Star is explaining to the staff that they're going to have to downsize, and he says support staff, technical staff, administrative staff, all of us have a part to play, even a walk-off part, so to speak, in this restructuring. And this man who's speaking, Marcel Duffy, is a man who, rather like me, stumbles over his words when he's nervous. And so he goes on, if we are to chart a way out of this impasse, we must all put our shoulders to the stone and leave no wheel unturned to pull together, setting our sights on a better future and a bright tomorrow. Maybe you may say these are gloomy times, but they can be illuminated with a new dawn, and they need not last forever for all of us. Some of you will be leaving, it is true, and we will attempt to anesthetize the pain for those of you who volunteer to walk that line to the maximum of our realistic possibilities. It might well be on the basis of last in, first out, the early worm getting the bird, in fact. But all that can be discussed. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, never will so much be done by so many for so few. And for those of you chosen to stay aboard our valiant ship, sinking though some Cassandras may try to depict it to be, I need only quote from Shakespeare at the Battle of Hastings. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. Well, I think that should keep the wolves from the hearth, he said, as he sat down before he realized that the microphone had not been switched off.
Hi, Tim Lambon. A lot of us have shared battlefields with you in various parts of the world, etc. But since 9/11, do you think that the world has become a more dangerous place for those of us who've been out in the battlefields, picking up on the media?
I think that specific, the area of kidnapping is possibly what you're referring to, which was never, or rarely, which has been an issue in the early 80s in Beirut, as you well know, Charlie, has become more prevalent. I think the perils affecting reporters, I think there was a time in living memory when being a journalist afforded a certain kind of protection. I think around the Balkan Wars, I think journalists became targets more than they had been in the past. I think that made life more dangerous. It may well also be that the fact that journalists going into these, I mean, look at the New York Times operation in Baghdad. I mean, we had a small army there. We had fortifications that were worthy of a warlord, and they were necessary to protect not only the expatriate staff, but certainly our Iraqi staff. I think that, in a way, shifts the debate. If you have to go into a war zone with a security detail, that I think in the case of there was a famous example, wasn't it, in northern Iraq with Brent Sadler, that his security detail was on film firing back, then you become part of the battle. And that's very dangerous. I think it was always a big debate when I was in Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, as it later became, was some journalists carried weapons, and they carried weapons primarily so that they would be welcomed in isolated farmsteads, and they weren't seen as people who were expecting to be protected by white farmers and so forth. That was always a very difficult call, because what are you going to do if you carry a weapon and you're attacked? You fire back, then you're a combatant, then you've shifted into a different ground. So do you go or you don't go? I think people have to go, and they enter, and the way, the result of that is indeed that the position of reporters becomes more dangerous, and also I think the nature of the conflicts that are covered has changed, and the readiness for kidnapping has increased, and I think it is a generally much more hazardous situation than...
Just a bit of a follow-up on that. If we think of places like Syria, Iran, obviously North Korea has always been out of bounds, but is there a way in which the globalization of the media has made governments very much more aware of foreign correspondents? You know, previously we could go into Gaza or into Palestine, and people would come and work with you. They still do to an extent, but there is very much a feeling that that governments know that whatever is said to a guy from the New York Times or from somebody from the BBC or whatever, that's going to go global. And it's now not just going to go to their national audience, but it's actually going to come to the people via a satellite who may take up arms against them. How do you think that's working out? Is this really affecting it? And I know it's a bit off your book.
Well, I think there are two things that come to mind about that. One is that it's actually very healthy that you can't go into a place and say, oh, so-and-so in Colwaysi, I can write what I want about that one, because they're never going to read it. I mean, and I think that probably, if we're all honest, I don't think it was as crude as that. But certainly you know now that things are going to be fed back. But secondly, and I think you've seen this in Syria, even very oppressive and regimes who are very clumsy in their PR have realized that, and they realized quite quickly, that when the debate was being dominated, as it still is to a large extent, by expatriate opposition groups with access to the internet, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, relying on whatever they were getting from inside, almost immediately, the Syrian news agency started getting much more quicker off the mark to put out its own narrative, to say these were armed dissidents, these were armed gangs, and it's as if they knew that if they said it, someone had to report it. So the debate did come back both ways. But I think it's very interesting that the debate comes back, and it makes foreign correspondents more of a target than they might have been in the past. Yeah, more visible.
Question over here.
Alistair.
There's a microphone on its way.
Thank you. Were you at all nervous about management reaction back at head office when you wrote the book? Because I've read it, and some of it could be construed as slightly critical of the guys who pay your bills.
Well, unless that buzzing in my pocket on my cell phone on vibrate means that I'm being told different, I think they've taken it with great insouciance, and I wasn't really nervous. After about the 16th rewrite, it seemed I had no cause to be nervous anymore, and I think these are issues that we all wrestle with, and there really was no cause to. No need at all to pull punches to the extent that I don't think I really did. I think the debate was part of the scenery of the book, and what I was interested in was the characters and how they developed, and so the answer is a little bit.
Anyone else have a question? Okay, over in the back there.
Sorry, I'm going to start. Good evening. I'm Kirsten from the New Age. I was wondering...
Is the New Age a realm? Or
well, in this room, a bit of a handful, but... I was wondering what advice you would have for young, aspiring foreign correspondents, of which I'm sure there are a few in this room.
Well, I was hoping that a friend of mine who... Michael Holman, formerly of the Financial Times, would be here. He couldn't make it because he has a great answer to that question, which is somebody asked him that same question, what should I do? The person, in fact, sitting right in front of you there, Tom, and the reply was, when this particular person was going out to Africa, Michael said to him, be subversive and have fun. And I think that is probably the best advice you can get. I'm a great believer in. I worked for the Lancashire Evening Post and the Cambridge News, and I did all my share of the coroner's courts and all those things. And I thought that was a terrific grounding. I mean, in terms of respect for getting things right. And before anybody points out there are one or two typos in this book, yes, there are, mea culpa, and I'll correct them as soon as the publishers can do that. I think that is a very good grounding. I think the respect for if you've covered a magistrate's court where a local businessman or woman has been fined for speeding, you can't afford to misspell their name because they really like a hawk, and you really got to have respect for very basic facts. I think that the advice to be subversive and have fun is probably the best advice about going abroad, and I would endorse my colleagues' advice in that regard. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Anyone else? Oh, please.
You mentioned Leveson and Murdoch. I just wondered what your thoughts were on the inquiry and the kind of call for a form of regulation of the press, whether you've been following it or not.
Well, I have been following it, and I followed a lot of the testimony and a lot of the ins and outs. I think it's an inordinately challenging story because there's so much that people can say now and a lot that can't be said because of pending criminal charges. I think what we've realized is that this does increase the pressure for regulation, and I think it's a huge pity that we've got to that stage, because I think the self-regulation inherent in trying to get things right worked for the bulk of the media for many, many years, and I think it would go on working. I don't think we need statutory regulation. I think that would be very, very dangerous. I personally, if I don't know anybody, I don't think, who's ever gotten a story by hacking into a phone. When I was in charge of the London bureau of the New York Times, I found it immensely frustrating that people wouldn't talk to me because they got contracts with big newspapers. And I thought those practices were not healthy for a free press, especially a free press with very shallow pockets like mine. But I still, that notwithstanding, I don't believe that if this leads to a broader statutory regulation or regulatory regime, it'll be extremely unfortunate and it'll be a huge step backwards.
Christopher Sylvester.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned expense accounts and expenses claims. And I find that when journalists meet to reminisce about the past, that is often uppermost in their minds. I wondered if you could tell us some of the more outrageous stories that you might have come across yourself.
Only if I can talk to my lawyer first.
The record, of course. Of course.
Yeah, I actually think a lot of these stories are completely apocryphal, and they go round. I mean, the story of the man, and it was a man who lost his Trilby hat in the Chicago riots and put it on his expenses. To replacement of Trilby hat, $25, and a final total, $400. And the accountant sent it back. Said, we don't pay for clothing for our reporters. Nonsense. Rejected. So he wrote a new expense account out, and it still came to $400. No mention of a Trilby hat, and there was a notation: "Now find the Trilby." So, but I've heard that about raincoats, canoes, assegais. I mean, you can find it all over the place. I mean, I think everyone.
And the Huskies in the Yukon.
The Huskies and there was a great one about
junk, which you have in here.
Which one?
The junk, which you have in the book.
There was a Time magazine reporter who wanted to get clearance to ship stuff back from his assignment and said, "I presume you'll pay for my old junk to be shipped?" And they said, "Indeed we will." And there it was. It was an ocean-going, large wooden boat from the South China Sea. Apocryphal, I don't know if it was, but it's a very good question, and it touches on a very valid point of our nostalgia. But
very hard for us then to condemn the bankers.
Indeed. Well, I mean, there's an element of speak for yourself in some of these stories.
Alan, you referred to the start of your career when you began life as a reporter, reporting the facts. How do you feel now that the fact the industry really very often is about journalists who become the story themselves?
I'd have to look around. I think that's always been a very, very valid way of telling the story. I think there's, we've had, if you go back many years to very, very well-known journalists who covered the Second World War, if you think of the people who had a following in Vietnam because of their personalities and who they were, I don't think that's a problem. I think that if journalists are the story in the sense that the Leveson inquiry is taking up a huge amount of ink and space, as I say, I think that is unfortunate, because I think that the bulk of the journalistic community is being made to pay for the errors or the criminality of the few. And that is not right. So if it's that side of it, whether personality journalism per se, I don't think it's such a bad thing. I think that why not? Why can't it's exciting and it's a way of telling the story. That's my feeling about it.
Anyone else? Oh, Ray Mosley.
Alan, as you have straddled both worlds, I wonder if you have any observations on the differences between British and American journalism, or the Anglo-American press versus everybody else.
Well, I think I've been inordinately privileged to work first for Reuters and then for the New York Times, because I think both of them wouldn't let you stray off the straight and narrow, and that's been very important. I think that...
Except in a few cases.
Huh?
Except in a few cases that we know well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, if we're talking about the Iraq War coverage and Jason Blair, if that's the twin elephants in the room, you're absolutely near. I'm very South African. My wife's South African, so I get these phrases. There's no doubt that even those very strict controls did not prevent huge lapses, very dangerous lapses that helped contribute to a war, and destroyed credibility, which is very, very difficult to rebuild, because even now, if you write a story on the web about this drumbeat about Iran, you very soon find that someone's going to send you a message saying, well, here we go again, same old New York Times, getting us ready for another war, which all you're doing is quoting what somebody's saying or actually describing something that's happened. So I do think that, that once it's destroyed, it's very difficult to rebuild. But I do think that in general, there's a very, very high standard in a certain level. I'm not talking about the National Enquirer. I'm talking about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, that has been generally maintained. I think it's a higher standard, and I'm not going to make many friends here. I think it's a higher standard, and in some technical ways, then you can't get away with without identifying your sources more closely in American journalism. You have to give your readers more of a steer about where you're getting stuff from. But I think that the comparison then on an Anglo-Saxon level, I think there are questions of detail and degree. The difference that we've seen with the French press is probably that the coziness of journalists with the political elite is something that was familiar in America in the Kennedy era, and it took the Strauss-Kahn affair in France to rattle it a bit. It was very familiar in Britain with the royal family in the 30s. It is far less so now, as we all know, that we've become collectively a lot more intrusive into questions of privacy and the privacy of the great and the good.
Could you tell us your thoughts on the value of instantaneous news and also the growing appetite for it, which seems to come perhaps at the expense of a little more in-depth coverage?
I think that, again, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, I don't think you can go back to how things used to be when there was invariably time for a greater, more reflection. I mean, I can remember a time when, as a news agency reporter, you'd see the TV correspondents going off to the airport with these bags with their film in, and that had to go off to wherever it went to be put on a satellite. And in fact, we were the cutting edge of instantaneous news. Instantaneous news has always been there, and it's just the delivery system that's changing and making it more instantaneous, more rapid fire. There's no doubt about that. I don't think that the two are incompatible. It comes back to the ability to pay for it. Investigative journalism is incredibly expensive because you have to commit people for long periods of time to stories that they may or may not be able to come through with and may not pan out. And that is very expensive, and it really does. There's no incompatibility. People want instantaneous news. They want to know exactly what's happening. They go on the net because the internet because they want to know what's happening around the world, and it's a natural instinct to want to know that, to do that. It should not, however, be at the expense of longer form journalism, and I think that it comes back to this whole question of evangelizing and saying, this costs money, this is worth having, this is central to democracy. If that doesn't sound, well, it does sound very pompous, I'm sorry, but it's true. And so I don't see necessarily a conflict between the two. It's only when the pressure for instant news outweighs the consideration of a longer form of journalism. That's what I'd say.
We'll take maybe two more questions, please. There and here.
Looking at Syria, and the dearth of news reports from the country now since the death of Marie Colvin, though I did hear something earlier today, I'm not sure who the reporter was. Do you believe that the apparent success of Assad in, getting rid of the foreign reporters will encourage the same in other dictators, in the way Egypt is going, for example? Some may think the Arab Spring is sort of in reverse. So I guess I'm asking for your view of, the absence of foreign reporters and the failure. I don't know where the news is not getting out. There are local reporters in Syria, but there seems to be very little news.
Well, I happily defer to Charlie on that, because he's just back from Syria, and I think he's probably got a more valid take on it.
There are some journalists coming in with visas. They give a certain number each month, and they're restricting them to 10-day visas. So you can go in for 10 days. While you're there, you can pretty much see anybody you want and go anywhere you want. You're not assigned a minder the way the Iraqis used to assign you a minder. Then there are others who are going in with the opposition illegally without visas, and as Anthony Shadid did, and doing some fine reporting. So it's not a complete absence of reporting. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. And when you're there on a visa, people are very happy to talk to you, and they've been very outspoken, both for and against the regime, at least in my experience and some of the colleagues I've spoken to. There was quite a large, by the standards of the moment, quite a large group in for the elections this week. Where they were reporting on the elections and other things as well. But at the end of their 10-day visas, they'll be leaving, and then other journalists are applying, and some are getting visas and some are not. It's unpredictable.
As you live in Paris, what is your view on the French press, and how do you think they've been covering the French election?
Well, I think the French press, like the press here to some extent, is partisan, and if you want the liberal left take, you get it from one newspaper. If you want a more conservative take, you read another. That's pretty much the way that the press has divided the market also in the UK. I think there's been a tremendous sense of excitement. I think the French press, where the papers like Le Monde really do excel, is in the level of analysis and very thoughtful pieces that they bring to any issue, not just the elections. And I think there've been one or two flyers just before. There was the Sarkozy's association with someone up on fraud charges. There was this question of new charges against Strauss-Kahn, which may have affected the vote one side or the other. But I thought it was the French press and television was remarkably a balance you could read if you provided you got enough papers, and read both sides of the story. I didn't see an issue with it at all, and I think in general we can respect that level of analysis that the best levels of French journalism bring out.
Now, before we go, you may notice that there's a table there. On the table, surprisingly, are copies of this book, Alan's book, which he will sign for you if you want to come and buy a copy. I see there are about 60 people in the room, so I would expect at least 57 copies to be sold before dinner. So please, at this moment, I want to thank Alan for coming and talking about his book and talking about his career and giving us his views on contemporary journalism as opposed to old-style journalism, because he knows them both intimately. And we should all thank him with our applause now, and thank him more importantly by buying and reading this wonderful and very funny book.
Can I just say one last thing? There's one quote from this book that everyone in this room, I guarantee, will sympathize with. "I sure could use a drink," Ed Clancy said.